Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ian Taylor, who's the executive editor of Travel Weekly, based here in the UK. Ian, tell me a little bit about yourself and Travel Weekly.
Okay, I've been a journalist since the 1980s. I've been covering travel on and off since the turn of the century. I've been at Travel Weekly since just before the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Travel Weekly is independently owned by the Jacobs Media Group, which is a travel and hospitality media and events company. Travel Weekly's one of the biggest titles. Caterer is another that people will have heard of. We're primarily for a UK outbound leisure audience, tour operators, travel agents, industry suppliers, and so on. Certainly the print magazine. People outside travel often think that's a dead or dying audience, but if you just look at ABTA members, all our readers in the industry will be ABTA members pretty well. A large proportion of them will be. Their collective revenue was 37 billion pounds in 2018, so it's a sizable portion of the travel industry. We also cover inbound and corporate travel because obviously there's overlap between the sectors. And we reach a European audience digitally, both through Travel Weekly and a digital publication, Travolution, and we have an events operation which is involved in events globally with, the UN World Tourism Organization, the WTTC, Pacific Asia Travel Association, and so on. So we reach beyond the UK. That's enough about me and Travel Weekly.
Oh, no. But I mean, in all seriousness, what's interesting is that Travel Weekly is trying to reflect the fact that the UK and the UK's role in travel in the future is obviously going to be affected by many things, partly the current crisis, but also partly Brexit coming up, which will throw all kinds of spanners into the works. But the UK is still predominantly the centre for incoming tourism in Europe. And I know the reason why we're based here at the moment and why we've been based here is that so many companies who sell Europe throughout the world have their main purchasing centres in London. And so you're looking at not just the domestic expenditure, I suppose, but you're also looking at all the inbound expenditure that takes place throughout Europe.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the UK travel industry aviation industry and travel punches way above its weight. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that the aviation industry in Britain is 50% bigger than that in Germany in terms of its revenue, transaction volume, and so on, despite the German economy being so much bigger. But that's a reflects that it's the importance of the sector to the GDP in Britain.
Yeah, indeed, and it may partly reflect the kind of I suppose the comparative freedom that the comparative regulatory freedom that the airlines have enjoyed. I mean, it was in the UK that we saw Laker, it's in the UK that we've seen Virgin, it's in the UK that we've seen Ryanair and EasyJet. Ryanair obviously being an Irish phenomenon, but very much launching itself on the back of UK demand. So, I mean, you're right, this is very rarely pointed out, that point. It's intriguing. And I suppose the other thing just to dwell on is that this almost preeminence, and it seems strange speaking as as a UK citizen, to be talking about comparative UK success, particularly at the moment. But this preeminence may come into question with Brexit. I mean, do you think that are you starting to see any companies drift away back into Europe?
No, not really. There's clear concern in the industry about Brexit, the implications for borders, for employment of people from overseas, from the EU, and so on, freedom of movement for employees around Europe, all the things you know about. But no, there isn't a companies made their preparations for Brexit in terms of where they're based already, really. So EasyJet's divided its business, having operations in Europe as well as in the UK, and I think companies are largely ready in that regard. It's more down to what the impact of leaving without sufficient preparation at borders and so on that's most concerning there.
I mean, the concern there, am I right in thinking, is simply the obligation that the destinations in Europe are obliged to impose really quite extensive checks on every visitor arriving, as indeed we do on any non-EU citizen currently arriving in the UK.
Yeah, well, there's that, and there's also the concern about the impact of this alongside a possible second wave of COVID. And whether Brexit will prove the straw that breaks some camels' backs.
Well, it's a formidable camel, but it's been weakened. So what's happening at the moment, Ian? I mean, we know that it looks pretty dreadful, both from an inbound point of view and from an outbound point of view. We've got a unique situation where there is no demand and no product. No demand and no product really implies there isn't a business to talk about. But do you see any signs of life? I mean, I think we could start perhaps by just looking at domestic travel within the UK. I mean, are people being optimistic on that front, or is it still very subdued?
No, I think people in the outbound businesses in the outbound sector are looking to get involved more in the domestic sector to the extent that they can, and just the difficulty of finding somewhere to stay in August, say, and the prices of places that are available will tell you that there's not a shortage of demand for domestic travel at the moment. I wouldn't say there's no demand and no supply of outbound travel. I mean, outbound travel to much of Europe and some places beyond resumed last Friday, July the 10th. And although the traveller numbers so far have been a trickle rather than a flood, the fact that travel has resumed at all by mid-July is something that a lot of people didn't expect to see at the heart of of lockdown. Consumer sentiment research tells us that a minority of people are prepared to book and take a flight at the moment. The latest YouGov survey suggests about 20% in the UK would take a flight, 2/3 wouldn't feel safe to do so. And the booking levels are about in line with that. I see a weekly tracker of consumer sentiment towards travel, and it suggests that only about 10 or 11% of people anticipate taking an overseas holiday by the end of September, but about 25% hope to take one by the end of the year. So, and the research suggests that demand for winter sun holidays, so obviously outbound, are double the normal rate at this time of year. So it isn't true to say there's nothing happening, but it's what's happening is not what those in the industry would like to see. Obviously, airlines are going to be across the board operating about 50% of their capacity in August.
And do you see that climbing in September, October? I mean, one of the fears that we've got is that if we look at the previous slumps in passenger confidence, and I fear I go back to 86 and 91 and 2001, 2 and 2007, 8. Largely, this has been we've been led out of this by airlines maintaining their schedules and effectively cutting prices to boost not boost demand, but boost carriage on their flights. With a hugely reduced capacity, it looks like the recovery is not going to be led by airlines using their spare capacity, but airlines following demand in introducing capacity. And this is one of the concerns some people have. Do you have an angle on that?
Well, I think it's going to be a combination. I mean, if you look at the offers from Wizz Air and so on at the moment, you couldn't say that there aren't offers in the market to stimulate demand. Um, but if airlines had maintained their capacity through the lockdown, they'd all be out of business by now. They were hemorrhaging.
I'm
Uh,
not blaming them for doing this. I'm just noting that this is the
so
case.
so they're making a judgment continually about can they get up to about 70% capacity and what on flights, and therefore what flights should they be putting on. And if August goes well, you'd imagine capacity will come back quicker than if capacity doesn't. But big airlines like Lufthansa, which has 760 odd aircraft, is planning on having 200 aircraft grounded in 2022 and 100 in 2023. So that none of them are expecting, with the exception of perhaps Wizz, are expecting to go back to the level that they were before for a considerable amount of time. I mean, the big issues I think are what level of failures are we going to see, not just amongst airlines but amongst travel companies. The surprise so far has been how few failures there have been. You'll be aware of Shearing's, the specialist leisure group, coach operator, so you can understand why maybe investors thought we're not going to put more money into a coach operator amid COVID. We've seen a US tour operator to the US, Funway, go down in the last couple of weeks. Fleetway Travel this week, which was luxury holidays. So far, the failures have been businesses where basically the plug's been pulled by investors deciding we're not going to put more money in because we can't see demand coming back quickly. The question is going to be what happens with the cash crunch that always comes in autumn, when businesses have had the sort of summer that they're going to have. Refunds have been a running sore in the outbound travel industry, both package holiday refunds and airline refunds, and some of that's been dealt with to an extent. Some companies have handled it better than others, but there's a real fear that consumers seeking chargebacks through card issuers is going to push businesses under now at this stage, and there's a fear that there's a tidal wave of those coming for some people. And then there's the big issue of job losses, the volume of job losses. Airlines are looking typically to cut 15 to 30% of jobs. Ryanair is virtually the only exception, and it's cut wages by 5 to 10% for the next 4 years, which of course will have an impact on any recovery. And people in the travel sector, the travel trade, expect really the same sort of volume of job cuts as at the airlines. So that's a big impact on the industry and on the ability of the industry to respond to recovery. Plus, of course, job losses of that order across the economy is going to affect people's ability to spend anyway, and they've already been hit by the financial impact of the lockdown.
And there
So
is a Brexit element to this as well, really. I'm just thinking, you're talking about job losses. A lot of the people who are being let go are going to be the people who've been recruited fairly recently, and a big proportion of the floating pool of employees within the travel industry are European citizens. I mean, they're the people who come to work in London, and they're attracted into the travel industry because up until now it's a booming industry which is hungry for foreign language recruits. These people are all going home, and it's going to be difficult to employ them again next year in the same way that we did this year.
yes, and there's no satisfactory answer yet, really, to how that's resolved. I mean, the government's thrown out a few ideas like the the bonus for employing trainees and apprentices and so on. But this isn't an answer for the travel industry at all. No.
No, and we can't get people, we can't train people to be native European speakers. It's a little bit
No.
tough.
No,
It's
exactly. No, this is there's no obvious solution to
I,
this.
what I'm intrigued by is you're saying that there is demand coming from the UK, and there is there's considerable. I mean, the need to go on a sun vacation is almost hardwired into a big section of the UK population, and so there is reasonably resilient. I mean, you've outlined the reluctance to fly. But from what you're telling me, is that most of the recovery, if you can call it a recovery in demand, or most of the demand that exists, is largely based around some destinations. Do you see any recovery in city tourism?
City tourism is going to be much more challenging, isn't it? I mean, you would imagine there will be, look, young people are still going to want to go to Amsterdam or Berlin or wherever it is, of course. But you would think that there would be an impact, certainly amongst older travellers who may be more reluctant to go to destinations they'll see as being crowded and so on. I mean, maybe the concerns about over tourism have been dealt with by COVID. We remain to see. Or maybe the definition of over tourism will be something quite different when we come out of this.
I don't think we're going to have a rerun of our over tourism discussions that we were having at the end of last year in the near future, Ian. But
No.
I'm actually concerned, I suppose, of the nature of the service economy in the various city destinations that we sell, as tour operators. And I think I'm just wondering if you're looking at London, for example, principally an inbound destination. 50% of Oxford Street, 50% of the turnover of Oxford Street is from foreign visitors. And if you remove them from the equation, and you've got the additional issues of the fact that a large proportion of the remainder of the spend is from people who work in the West End, and there are not that many people working in the West End at the moment, the prospects for the service economy generally are fairly bleak. And you worry about intermediaries still being in business. I sometimes worry about the product that we've got to sell. And I'm wondering how far, I suppose the question really is, how can we prime pump demand and encourage people to get out in this environment? There are some prerequisites that we can't cover. I mean, we probably need to have something like a vaccine against the virus before people are really confident to start moving around. But even then, what do you think it will take to get demand back on the road, principally for city tourism, which is what I'm interested in?
Well, look, I think for really, if you want to get demand back to where it was, it's going to take a vaccine or vaccines, because the likelihood is that this will require different vaccines every year or 2 years or so on, in the way that flu does.
Mm.
Now, the progress on developing a vaccine is unprecedentedly fast, and work that would normally take 10 years has happened in the few months of the pandemic so far. So, there's reasons to be optimistic on that, but that doesn't mean there's going to be a vaccine this time next year. It could do, but it may not. So you could be looking at 18 months or 2 years of circumstances which are more challenging for some aspects. I mean, I cannot see nightclubs reopening for the foreseeable future, for example, and the destinations in Europe that are open now, nightclubs are not open. So that form of tourism, clubbers, that's off the,
We're
that's
going to
off
have to change
the
our
agenda.
travel patterns, Ian. There's no way around it.
But I think some of this, the industry is just going to have to get used to it. That it's changed. I think there's lot of voices in the industry now are calling for um, rapid development of testing at airports to open destinations like the US for travel to the US from the UK without quarantine on return, and for visitors from the US. But my understanding is that there are real problems with that. Public Health England apparently has already ruled out testing at airports as a way to relax the quarantine restrictions, because uh, a single test isn't reliable enough. So NHS staff are tested regularly. You can pass a test one day and be infecting people within 72 hours or something. So the sort of simple solutions that some in the industry would like are just not there, and aren't going to happen. And it would be more sensible really to deal with the reality. I think there are real impediments to a speedy recovery, which is the growing knowledge about the COVID. Is it spread in aerosol sprays? Does that therefore mean that indoor social distancing is going to have to be maintained, and things indoors are going to be much more difficult? It does appear that the virus is most active at 4 degrees C, which is a European winter. So expect a second wave. A study in Spain suggests that people show antibodies to having had the infection, but then subsequently 2 or 3 months later don't appear to have the antibodies. And is this because they only had an asymptomatic infection? It's not clear. So there are all sorts of reasons to be cautious and to think that a limited opening of travel is what the industry is going to have to live with. Certainly, all the major airlines are not expecting to run much smaller operations for some years.
Right. Can we try and I'm looking for some sunshine here. It's a grey day at the moment outside in London, and I try to think of a positive angle here. I mean, people seem to think that this is going to be an opportunity for less crowded destinations. There is a debate about this, and some people think that the pattern of demand and what you're outlining is a very much a reduced pattern of demand and a reduced level of supply, it has to be said. Do you think there's going to be much scope for expanding areas which hitherto have been not as popular? So, I mean, it would be, regional areas of destinations, areas outside the main cities, zones where people can be by themselves slightly more than they would otherwise be. There is a general trend to say that this is an opportunity in this area. Do you think that's true?
Uh, Look, that's undoubtedly true. We both know people in the industry are remarkably uh, adept at finding new ways to operate, and developing new products, and so on. I'm struck. I live in Dorking in the North Downs, and I'm struck by how places where I regularly visit to walk the dog and so on are overwhelmed by visitors now. The number of people on bikes, the number of people just walking and so on has been it's transformative, really. So I think a lot of people will want to continue doing activities like that that they maybe haven't been doing. They're doing that rather than maybe going to a shopping centre or whatever it might be that they previously did on a Saturday. So I think that there are all sorts of opportunities. Look, I think city tours are going to be less appealing for some time, you would imagine. Broad strokes. The United States is going to be less appealing for some time. Long haul travel may be less appealing. The idea of being on a flight for 9 hours or something could be unappealing for some time. Flying might be less appealing at all for a proportion of people for some time. Short trips might be less appealing. Do I really want to go wear a mask for 6 hours at an airport on the flight, arrive there and just stay two nights? maybe people will think less about doing short trips internationally, but that's possibly then an opportunity for the domestic sector, isn't it? Um, Events, I think, are going to be physical events are going to be very difficult. I'm somewhat staggered to see that World Travel Market anticipates going ahead in London in early November, when all the events that I can see across Europe in the industry that were scheduled for October are being cancelled. So I wait to see where the World Travel Market takes place as a physical event. I think corporate travel is going to be uh, corporate travel. Analysts say they expect it to be 20% down permanently following this, and corporate travel never came back to the level it was post the financial crisis, to the level it was pre-financial crisis. I think short business trips where people turn around in a day or stay one night and come back. Would you want to do that really at the moment when you can do a Zoom call? But longer trips, important, where it's important to have face-to-face contact, that's going to happen. So I think the industry is going to have to adjust to being a different size, doing a lot of things differently, sees what new opportunities there are, and maybe come to terms with the fact that this idea that travel and tourism will endlessly grow at 4% a year has perhaps hit the buffers, at least for a period of a couple of years or so.
Well, I mean, that's a uniquely sobering, not uniquely sobering, but that's a sobering prospect you've got. I would mildly counter that. One thing I think we can be fairly certain of is that, well, if we can be certain of anything, that 2021 will show a growth over 2020. And it's possible that 2022 will also show a growth over 2021. I don't think we'd be reckless in making that prediction, and it may be indeed more than 4%, or I hope it is. Let's put it like that. And I think there is a possibility, and I just run this past you as a counter argument. There is a possibility that if you're looking on an inbound level, and it will be duplicated on an outbound level, if you're looking at an inbound level, more than 50%, roughly 60% of the groups and individuals who booked to come to Europe last year have rescheduled for 2021. They said, right, we're cancelling it this year, we'll do it next year. So we've got a substantial pent-up demand for the experience of coming to Europe, which has been stalled from this year, and we'll have all the latent demand that we would anticipate wanting to come to Europe in any normal year, if next year is normal. So given that we've got pent-up demand and latent demand, together with the possibility of some reasonably competitive pricing that we can anticipate for next year, and the possibility of a totally unique experience. You said that over tourism is not going to be on the agenda. For a prospective visitor to Europe, you've got the chance of seeing Venice, seeing Florence, seeing Rome, seeing Paris, seeing London, like you've never been able to see it in summer or high season for decades. And so, both the product and the demand is there for next year. There are several things to be said against it, but there's more than a possibility that something will happen next year which is substantially better than this year.
Oh, of course, Tom, of course I agree with that. Look, the bookings for next year are very strong. Bookings for this winter and for summer 2021 are up, absolutely. Looking very, very, very healthy. Of course, when I said about the growth, I was talking about the long-term growth rate, which has been 4% a year globally for decades, even with the crises and the downturns that you mentioned. And what I was suggesting was I don't know that it will necessarily get back to that long-term growth rate, but of course there'll be a return. I mean, to put in perspective, I said earlier that about 25% of UK adults say they intend to take an outbound holiday by the end of this year. Well, if 25% of UK adults fulfill that intention, that
Mhm.
will be more than half the numbers who normally go away in any year
Mhm.
just in the remainder of this year. So that's an extraordinary level of demand in
Yeah.
the circumstances, and almost two-thirds of UK adults say they intend to take an outbound holiday by April next year. So, in reality, not all those people will. Those who intend to take an overseas holiday frequently don't take one. Most often, young people who intend to go everywhere when they're asked in a survey. But nonetheless, that's an extraordinary level of demand, and there will be fantastic offers available. Yes, I mean, there's no reason for people in the industry to slit their wrists, but it is going to be a smaller industry for a bit, with fewer people working in it, unhappily. I mean, the Business Travel Association expects 50% of jobs at travel management companies and corporate travel suppliers to go. Um,
Look,
unfortunately, that's the reality.
yeah, I'm not questioning that we're looking at carnage. The question is what will the landscape look like afterwards? And the truth is that we don't know. But you've I suppose you've given us a very good guided tour of the state of our ignorance in this area and pointed out all the areas that we need to be cautious about. What do you think the government should do, both at a European and a UK level?
Well, that's the the UK government messed up hugely, didn't it, at the outset on testing, on PPE, on care homes, and so on. And those are the big issues. Um, the industry was deeply up, fed up about the whole quarantine thing, and the government got that so cockeyed with the competing lists and so on, and the lack of clarity. Yes, you can travel to all sorts of places without being quarantined on your return, but you will be quarantined when you arrive at your destination. All that and so on. The most clearly, sectors want financial support and so on. Actually, a lot of what the government's done has been unprecedented and roundly welcome. The furlough arrangements and so on, the business loan facilities and so on, people know about. UK Inbound pointed out that the opening up of inbound travel was too late for most of the inbound sector, and of course they're right about that. The key thing I think the industry needs from the government is better coordination. I mean, the failure to coordinate the FCO list advice and the DFT list of COVID safe countries and so on was abject. The run up to it, with the drip of information and the briefings and counter briefings by political advisors to the government, was, you know, deeply unhelpful. One day it was going to be 40 destinations, the next day it was going to be 95. Portugal was going to be on it up until the last minute. No, Portugal's not on it. It's so all that's deeply frustrating. At the same time, the EU and the EU member states haven't played much of a better game. I mean, you can say that individual states like Germany and so on and Portugal have handled the virus much better than the UK has. But in terms of coordination across the EU, it's not there. So it's been a bit of a dog's dinner across the board, really. And the industry's frustration's understandable, but also people need to accept sometimes that politics is is not economics, unfortunately.
It's the messiest businesses. No, you're quite right. And I think what's interesting is that in Europe, the one thing the Commission has been doing ever since May has been trying to re-establish Schengen as a true common open travel area. And it means that, and in this they've largely succeeded. It's not exclusively true, but they've largely succeeded. And it means that places like Spain, places like Italy, and France, they've got a domestic audience of 400 million people, and they you know they've got grounds for some kind of salvage operation for their inbound industries this year, and it's something that I fear in the UK it's sadly lacking.
I mean, for the UK outbound sector,
Mm,
75% of outbound travellers go to Spain, Italy, France, Greece, Portugal, etc. And with the exception of Portugal, and from July the 27th, probably also Portugal, those destinations are open. So three quarters of you know, destinations are available to three quarters of UK outbound travellers.
yeah. Just say thank you very much. This has been a really interesting discussion.
Well,
And
always a pleasure to talk to you, Tom.